Doctors of Reddit, what is your how the hell are you even alive right now story? I had this patient before medical school when I was an EMT, and he still sticks with me. 20-something-year-old male, motorcycle vs SUV 1. We arrived on scene to a man, face down in a pool of blood, 1L. We were told he was wearing a helmet, but it was nowhere to be found. He was about 30 feet from his bike and there was a clear trail of blood to the bike, because he wasn't wearing leathers. We rolled him onto the board and that was the first beating heart I ever saw. His road rash was so bad it eroded his chest wall, and we were staring at his heart, a collapsed lung, his great vessels, and the branches of the brachial plexus. Amazingly, they were all intact. Of course he had multiple injuries to his other extremities, mandible, zygomatic arches, etc., but we frankly didn't care at the time. We were on scene for no more than 2 minutes before we sped off to the trauma center. I remember transferring the patient to the chief of trauma surgery, whose first words when the trauma pad was removed were "holy shit." I thought for sure he died. Fast forward 2 years, when I was at my primary care physician's office for a checkup after my medical school interview, and saw a collection bin for a veteran's wedding. Guess who? Yup, it was him. They had taken his left arm to reconstruct his chest, since the nerves were shot, and he recovered. Not a doctor, but this is what I have been told repeatedly when I was in the hospital for my open heart surgery. How the hell are you still alive? Backstory, I basically was born with a congenital birth defect which has an extremely high mortality rate, like 1 in 120 million of it happening, and about 95% to 99% chance of dying. Not only did I survive it for 20 years, I played lacrosse for 4 years. Now the issue was that I was missing a major blood vessel on my heart that is required to pump blood. My body compensated in such an extreme way that the blood vessel on the right side of the heart went down and around the heart and attached itself to the aorta. My heart was basically circulating around itself, and the rest of my body didn't get enough blood. So how was it found out? Blew my nose and full-on heart attack. Surgeons repeatedly stated and asked how was I alive, and you played lacrosse for 4 years. Also, the main surgeon stated that anyone with this condition usually dies at birth. They only know of the condition from autopsies. TLDR. I blew my nose. I had a heart attack. Found out birth defect. All doctors are baffled. I have medical journals of my condition. Edit. Wellfac. My highest comment is now my heart attack. Edit 2. I'm going through and answering questions. Lots to read through. Edit 3. I, for the life of me, cannot remember what my condition was called. I will make a call on Monday to my cardiologist and find the name. So be prepared to be updated on the name. Edit 4. I just got off the phone with my cardiologist nurse. It is called an anomalous left anterior descending artery. Now time to find the journals. Nurse here, but I have some good stories coming from level 1 trauma center. I had a pedestrian vs train once. He was stumbling home drunk and passed out on the train tracks. He was hit straight by the front of the train, bounced to the side, got hung on the side of the train, and then dragged 100 yards while the train stopped. He wound up in a coma for a week and paralyzed from the waist down, but he lived with no major neurological deficits other than the whole not being able to move his legs thing. Had a patient once with throat cancer and his tumor ate through his carotid artery. Due to the cancer and a previous surgery he had a fistula, a hole, in his neck. He and his wife were at home. He was dozing in the sunroom. Wife goes to the kitchen and comes back to see him covered in blood and bloody handprints on the glass door where he tried to open it and get help. He had perfed his carotid artery and the blood was pouring, spurting, out of his fistula. This tiny little old lady pulled the drapes from the window, jumped on his neck, and pushed her life alert button. Somehow she held pressure enough to keep him from bleeding out, and we actually saved the man with very little neuro deficit. People perf carotids and the IQ, and don't survive the run to surgery, and he survived until EMSA got to him, and got him to the hospital, all because his wife thought quick, and was remarkably strong. Edit, spelling is hard. Not a doctor, but my sister's cardiologist has this story now. My family has had trouble holding on to health insurance for many years, but my sister's yearly heart checkups have been a priority. She was born with Epstein's anomaly of the tricuspid valve, which basically means blood leaks backwards and pumps oxygen very inefficiently. One year her appointment got postponed a few months due to a switch in providers and all that stupid shit. My sister was in 10th grade gym class and having trouble running every day. That's what she told us. I feel kinda sick after class, which we thought would mean she got lightheaded. Turns out she was puking every class due to the exertion. My parents immediately decided that checking up on her heart would be the best decision, and thank God they did. Her cardiologist said her heart was the size of a small watermelon, and it was an absolute wonder she was only puking and not passing out or literally dropping dead if she was running a mile in less than 30 minutes, and I think her mile was under 15. He said it was one of the most advanced states of Epstein's he'd seen, if not the worst currently unoperated case in the country, US. Basically, she had to have an emergency open heart surgery, cone procedure and bidirectional Glenn at Boston Children's, and now, 4 years later she's still on medication and is looking to get a pacemaker. Unbelievably, the asshole gym teacher still gave her a B final grade. Not a doctor, but I do medical research which includes chart abstractions. I was abstracting a chart on a 90+ year-old rancher in Montana, still an active dude without any major health issues. I was abstracting what led up to his minor heart attack and couldn't hardly believe the ICD-9 codes, so I went into the more granular notes. A storm rolled in while he was checking on the cattle, so he hopped on his four-wheeler to get home. Boom, he gets hit by lightning, causing him to wreck his four-wheeler. He must have been okay, because he gets up and starts hobbling home, only to step on a rattlesnake and get bitten. Shakes that off too, and manages to get home, only to have a heart attack while waiting for medical services to get to his rural home. This dude had ICD-9 codes for lightning strike, motor vehicle accident, snake bite, and heart attack all on the same day. Spent like 4 days in the hospital, and went home seemingly no worse for wear. Damn, I hope I'm that resilient at 90. Edit, there are no HIPAA identifiers here. I just did my gazillionth HIPAA training last month. Even specifying from Montana is okay. You aren't supposed to disclose age for patients 89+, but such ages and element may be aggregated into a single category of age 90 or older. I'm not even sure the dude was over 90. I just remember he was old. I got sick when I was 19, soon after I had returned from hiking the PCT. Sick enough to be hospitalized, sick enough that all of my family flew out to talk to me, sick enough that my doctor told me, "You're going to die soon. This is a reality. We do not know what is wrong with you, and if you live it will be under a power greater than me and my colleagues can muster." At this point he got super uneasy. "I'm keeping you in my prayers." So it was at that point, while enduring multiple organ failure, that I tried to make peace with my very small and short time on this earth. For a week I was as ill as anyone who was dying in the ICU with me. I spent 80ish of those hours in a coma and the rest in a partially waking/resting state that was painful and awful. On the 8th day I could feed myself. Although it was difficult, because during the previous 7.5 days my body destroyed about 30% of its muscle mass in chunks in various places, my right leg on my thigh, both of my biceps, my lumbar on the left side, the top of my abdominal muscles, and the muscles in my right hand. While I was making the attempt at feeding myself, the doctor poked his head in and said, "You might be getting better. Whatever you're doing, keep it up. How's the pain?" Well, the pain was bad, but I wanted to live. Within a week I was standing, and 6 months later you wouldn't have known I was ever sick, except for a light limp that remains to this day many years later. The attending physician, while I was in the hospital, who said these things to me and talked to me, saw in his office about 3 months into the recovery process. He said almost those exact words, "I do not know how you lived." The doctor then told me that he had told my family to make arrangements for my death right after that initial conversation, and that when I had slipped into a coma he was pretty sure that was the end of it. That's my story of medical trauma. Edit. Apparently I didn't make it clear, but they never figured out what made me sick. As a stopgap to secondary infections I was put on antibiotics and fluids, but they never found out. A year and a half ago my dad got a new cardiologist because of insurance reasons and high blood pressure. He got standard new doctor tests and the doctor gave him an echocardiogram, I think. He called my dad when he got the results and told him to get to the ER immediately. He had an aortic dissection. My dad, not knowing what that was, charged his phone up, finished his episode of The Young and the Restless, and called car service. For the majority of people who don't know what an aortic dissection is, it's when there's a tear in your aorta, which causes the blood leaving your heart to fill up the walls of the artery until it has an aneurysm and it bursts. Basically, if it bursts, you die. It's what killed John Ritter. Usually, when it tears, you feel pain in your chest, but in very few cases there's no pain. My dad was one of the very few cases. The mortality rate once the aorta tears is 1-2% per hour for the first 48 hours, meaning 50% die within the first 2 days. When he got to the hospital, his aorta was 3x the size of a healthy person, and the surgeon said that it was likely dissected for 4 days minimum, and if he waited a few more hours he would certainly be dead. After the surgery to replace his artery with an artificial one, which took 8 hours and involved essentially and intentionally killing him 3 times, the surgeon told him he was a miracle case and he really shouldn't be alive, as his aorta was past the size it ruptures 9/10 times. The kicker? When he called my aunt to tell her she was the emergency contact, he told her he was having minor surgery on his big toe because he didn't want anyone to worry. Nobody besides his girlfriend, she knew but had to fly back home, so she couldn't be the contact, knew until 6 hours into the surgery what it actually was. TLDR insurance made dad get a new doctor. The new doctor found something in a standard first visit test and sent him to the hospital. Should been dead by the time the doctor saw it, went to hospital to have emergency open heart surgery with only a few hours maximum to spare. Obligatory not doctor disclaimer. About a year and a half ago, a friend of mine was going mountain biking. He wasn't actually on the mountain yet, just riding his bike over to a friend's house. They were going up on the mountain together. He stopped to tie his shoe and, for some reason, took off his helmet. Finished tying his shoe, pedaled 10 feet, and got hit by a car. Someone, we suspect it was the driver, called in an anonymous tip to the hospital. They found my friend with a broken skull on the side of the road, hospitalized him, then discovered that he had a bleed in the membrane between his skull and brain. It was pushing on brain tissue. I believe it was something like a 20% chance of survival. The trauma team drained his skull, stapled it back together, sewed his head up, and 2 days later he woke up extremely concussed and confused, but otherwise fine. Scared the hell out of us and his family, but all is well, except he occasionally feels the weather and gets a few more headaches than usual. Bright side to all of this is that he found his calling once he was back in the workforce. He immediately became a paramedic and is currently getting his certification to work as a fire rescue paramedic. Now he saves other people's lives. Full circle. Since few actual doctors are posting, I'll post since I'm not a doctor. I have 2 stories. 5 or 6 years ago my brother went hiking with some friends in a park in northeastern Ohio called Nelson's Ledges. Anyone from around Cleveland will know the place. Anyway, since it's Ohio, pretty much all rocks, cliffs, boulders, etc. are going to be slick with moss or just wet. There were no railings at the time, just lots of signs that said do not climb. He was at one of the highest points in the park, where some giant boulders formed a ravine with a small creek at the bottom. He was goofing around and trying to show off and slipped right off the edge. He fell at least 30 feet first, landing with one leg locked as it hit a small boulder at the bottom, while the rest of his body kept going. The impact smashed his foot up into his tibia, shin bone, splitting it right up the middle before the tibia basically exploded into 50 smaller pieces. Since the bottom was all water with no shore, since it was just a gap between rocks, he had to drag himself 100 feet or so until he found a rock he could lay on. He had to be lifted out on a gurney by helicopter. The other story is what happened to me 17 years ago. I turned left in front of a speeding semi. He was going 52/83 kilometers per hour as it just started to pass through the intersection. Don't ask, I was young and not paying attention, striking the car on the front right corner. The car was obliterated, and the engine was pushed through the dashboard. When the car stopped sliding 100 feet away, I actually managed to get out of the car and take a single step before collapsing from shock. It saved my life, but all of my injuries were caused by my seatbelt because I wasn't wearing it properly. 2 broken ribs and a perforated small intestine. I had open abdominal surgery and was in the hospital for a week. Not a doctor. I was patient. Had 5 different specialist teams come and try to figure out what had happened. One night I was at a friend's house and my neck started feeling all crazy. We were drinking, and I powered through it. At about 6 AM I woke up cold as fuck and just took the liberty of taking a bath to warm up. Go home, still feel like shit. But I write that off to too much alcohol. A day more goes by, I think I might have pneumonia. This was before Obamacare. It actually got passed while I was in the hospital, so I figure that I can tough pneumonia out. Then my neck and back start hurting. My symptoms are pretty close to bacterial meningitis, but not exactly right. In a fever haze I don't call a friend or do something reasonable. I faking Facebook that I might need someone to take me to the hospital. I tell them that I think I have pneumonia. They x-ray my lungs. I don't. She runs me through the meningitis mobility tests. I don't have meningitis. She asks me about my medical history. I tell her I've only been to the hospital twice in my life. Once when I fell in a bonfire, the second when I broke my ankle. She decides that I'm obviously faked up and runs an MRI on me. They cost a lot. Turns out that I had a 7-inch, 13cm abscess on the inside of my mediastinum. It had ruptured as was pouring pollutants into my body. She came back and turned to the other nurse and said, "He has a 13cm abscess on his mediastinum." The other nurse responded with, "I didn't know that could happen." She says, "I didn't either. If I had waited a day or 2 more, I would most likely be dead." Anyhow, I had 5 different medical specialist groups come in and run me through their diagnostics. Even had a class come through just to check me out. They never figured out what caused it or even what the infection was because it was so close to my heart. I just did daily infusions for 3 months and I believe that I'm okay now. When I was a paramedic student I was doing placement in my hometown, which was a rural town of about 12k people, so there was a reasonably sized hospital. Around my former home there were a lot of smaller communities ranging from 2k down to a few hundred people. We get called first thing in the morning to the hospital to pick up a guy who came in overnight and take him to the airport for transport via plane to Melbourne. He's basically up in the hills, where there's nothing but winding roads, wombats, and kangaroos, where he came off his motorcycle after attempting to dodge some of the local wildlife that clearly didn't give a fuck about looking both ways before crossing the road. He's given himself a good old skittle down the road, picked himself up, and dusted himself off, and in true Aussie fashion decided, bit faked, better go get someone to take a gander at this. He self-presented to the local police station in a small town of about 1,500 people to say, "Yeah, faked up a bit. Need some help, mate," at which point they've immediately called the ambulance to come and collect him. It's a good 2-hour and change drive to the hospital where they x-ray him and discover a cervical spine, neck fracture and refer him to the surgical unit in Melbourne. Not bad for a bloke that's broken his neck and decided fuck it, better rock around to the cop shop to get this sorted out. I'm not a doctor, I'm the son of the patient. My father is a magnet for medical issues. Now, this has all happened over the course of his 52-year life. So it's not all at once. But, still. Broken a sum total of 27 bones, fell out the car door, grabbed on, dragged us through gravel at the shoulder of the road for a quarter mile. Same car, several weeks later, rolled 6 times when taking a sharp country turn at 70+ miles per hour. Tore a tendon in his shoulder while carrying a refrigerator. Had surgery 10 years later when he got tired of his arm falling out of his shoulder socket. 1 week after the above shoulder surgery, slipped on some winter ice while starting his car, landed directly on the elbow, and completely destroyed all the surgical work. laid on the ground with his face about a foot away from the exhaust pipe of his running car for 10 minutes before one of our neighbors came outside to investigate the small girl crying somewhere in the parking lot. Fell off the back of a pickup truck onto a metal pipe. Had he fallen 2 inches to the right, the doctor said he probably would have obliterated his tailbone, rectum, and a decent portion of his pelvis. Instead he just had a second asshole for a few months. Now has a wicked bud scar, or so he says. Diagnosed with diabetes roughly 16 hours after eating an entire package of double stuffed Oreos. Maintained a healthy blood sugar level for several years, despite not taking medications. Was admitted to the hospital after passing out on the way to the bathroom at work. Upon arrival, we were told his blood glucose was over 600. For reference, it should never go above 180, even after eating with diabetes. Most recently, he was diagnosed with testicular cancer last April. The first time he decided to seek medical attention for something. He'd been having stomach pains for roughly 3 months. Post-chemo, during a full body scan, it was discovered that he had apparently had a stroke sometime in the past 5 years and nobody had noticed. In recap, diabetes, cancer, stroke, hella broken bones, rolled a car. Doc here. A fair number of my stories might be the guy in late stage heart failure who's just hanging in there, incredible lab values, serum sodium of 80, unreadable initial I-stat. A lot of my stories aren't really going to mean much to the layperson, because these numbers won't really mean much without context. But I do have a few cool stories I share with friends. One guy had a congenital heart defect that caused an arrhythmia. He didn't know about it until much later, when he started playing minor league hockey in the AHL. Turns out, the guy started passing out during practices, and one time needed to head to the hospital as a result, apparently cardiac arrest. Normally CGs look a lot like this ECG at the time. Basically he was going into something called Torsades D points. Anyway, he recovered from every incident without issue, and he was finally seen by a cardiologist who referred him to a specialist cardiologist known as an electrophysiologist who would use a special procedure to fix his heart, hopefully, indefinitely. The problem is, Torsades is incredibly scary, could kill the guy, and could strike at any moment. So he had to wear something like this called a life vest which will shock his heart if it goes into Torsades, likely saving his life. Now, I've never been cardioverted, shocked, before. But, from what I've heard, from the very rare instance that it happens to someone who is conscious, it feels like getting kicked firmly in the chest. It hurts. So this pack had a sort of dead man switch that you could press and hold. The device would say something like, arrhythmia detected, issuing shock in 5, 4, 3. And if you got your finger on that switch you could hold off the shock until you pass out, you know, from your heart inadequately pumping blood. So this happens to this 20-something-year-old hockey player, and he presses the button, and he holds it, and he walks 5 blocks to the hospital, and by the time he gets to the ED, he's in a normal rhythm. The ED staff think maybe he was mistaken, but they download the data from the pack and the guy was in, like, 2 solid minutes of Torsades before spontaneously converting. He was in such profoundly good cardiovascular health that, even though his heart was pumping maybe 5% of the usual volume at the time, he was giving enough oxygen to his brain to stay awake and moving. New story. I have a bunch of stories I can share, but I'll leave you with one more. I was at a regional level 1 trauma when I got called for a code. The team assembles, and we get the initial report of a guy riding a snowmobile and hitting a fence. So this guy's wheeled in, and, at first I think oh he's intubated. On closer inspection the tube isn't coming out of his mouth, it's coming out of his neck. What actually happened was the guy decided to do some night snowmobiling. I didn't know this was a thing. Anyway, he's driving around property he doesn't own, and he happens to catch a wire fence that is exactly neck level. The wire transects his trachea, the windpipe that we breathe through. Here's where it gets holy shit. The large arteries that essentially rest next to the trachea were run to shade. If they had been lacerated, he would have bled to death prior to EMS arriving. The one smart thing he did was travel with a buddy who called 911. They sent EROM to go pick the guy up. Even though he missed these arteries, he was still compromising his airway and aspirating a lot of blood. So, the paramedic on scene tried to intubate and made the split-second decision to intubate through the opening in the trachea. I was able to personally confirm his view, and he had nothing from above. When I asked the paramedic how he found his landmarks to do what was basically a crick, he said I just looked for the bubbles as my guide. We reverted to a trach, made a primary closure, and the guy was awake the following day and in relatively good spirits. That medic was so badass, I'll never forget him. My girlfriend at the time made homemade donuts and we fired him a big plate. I stuck a net tube through the hole and gave the treats to him and his friends for the save. I have more if interested. Former vet tech here. Still have the cat that will never ever die. Neighbors had moved out and dumped their cat, a cute muted orange tabby. With a house full of animals already, there was no way I was going to take this one in. Decided to wait 3 days, and if the owners didn't come back I'd call the shelter. The morning of day 3 when hubby and I were driving down the road, she did an in the middle of the road standoff between our Explorer and stubborn cuteness. We gave in. 6 months later, my daughters came running to me, telling me Thumbs polydactyl, and kept to our run of no fluffy or normal names, was acting funny under their bed. Vestibular out of nowhere, head tilt and eyes darting back and forth. Ugh. Piled everyone in the car and rushed to work on my off day. By the time we got there she was dead, but having the kids with me and decided to go ahead and run her in as an emergency. All hands immediately on deck and they did a full code on her. EP to the heart, hooked up to a bag and they were breathing for her, and after an hour with some miracle happening, she started to come back. We left her there overpass. I left strict instructions that, if she passed again, to please just let her go. I had no idea how long she'd been without oxygen when she died in the car and had to explain to the kids that she'd probably never be the same. Family decisions were made. We all headed home. Middle of the night she coded again. Dead. Gone. Doc goes against my express wishes and they do the same dance again. EP to the heart, bagged breathing for hours, and damned if she doesn't make a second comeback. Dataline 10 years later. Thumbs is still with us and enjoys her days living on her special windowsill. There's no reason whatsoever that she should still be alive. She has obvious brain damage, does a lot of head pressing, has head bobbing like a Parkinson's patient, and yowls instead of meows. The strange thing is that she has super feline strength. Last time I took her in for a nail trim it took me and 2 other techs to hold on to her while the vet attempted it. She can get out of a burrito towel within seconds. If you try to bathe her she can climb a wall while you have her scruffed. Oh, and chronically goes just outside of the litter box because her depth perception is off. TLDR, cat came back from the dead twice. Still sitting on her windowsill. Not a doctor, but a nurse here. Guy was a 30-something male. It became evident during his time with us in intensive care that there were some deep-seated issues with his family and girlfriend or girlfriends as they would book visiting times with us so as never having to see one another. The man had been on the phone with one of his girlfriends, clearly arguing. She had, by her own admission, suggested in the heat of the moment that he jump in front of a bus. The guy had severe depression, diagnosed bipolar disorder and weekly therapy sessions. It will come as no surprise, therefore, that this suggestion became an impulse, and he did so. He went under the front wheels of the bus and got stuck beneath. The wheels shattered his pelvis, ruptured his bowels, and punctured his lung, along with breaking several ribs. It also caused degloving on his right hand leg, from the knee down. If you haven't heard of degloving before, be thankful. But essentially, imagine taking a glove off, and then imagine that your skin is the glove in this analogy. The guy had severe peritonitis from all the bowel contents loose inside his shattered hip. He needed a lot of replacements, a lot of surgery for the debridement of all his wounds. The leg was filthy with tarmac, and very badly infected. He had to have bilateral chest drains for his lungs, a body brace to stabilize what was left of his pelvis. He was intubated and unable to breathe for himself. The list is ceaseless. And yet, he lived. Sort of how the hell are you even alive? It was more how the hell are you still conscious? And I was the patient, not the doctor. One Sunday morning in the spring of 2013, my mom rushed me into the ER. I had woken up at 6 in the morning, an oddity in itself. with a stabbing feeling in my lower right abdomen. I took an ibuprofen, and it didn't have any effect. Instead it got worse. At this point, it felt like someone had stabbed me multiple times in that one spot, stabbed me one more time, left the knife inside, and started twisting it like a mixer. At first I thought it was period cramps, since I always got them at incapacitating levels, but the pain was too far to the right. It dawned on my mother that I might have appendicitis, and she threw me in the car and drove to the ER. We got to the ER and there was no line to get to the triage nurse, so I was taken in immediately. By now my skin had gone from white to grey, and I was on the verge of collapsing. They ask me to rate my pain, and it takes me a while to figure it out. I feel like I'm being stabbed, but I'm not actively being mauled by a bear or on fire, so I say I'm at 8 instead of 10. Triage nurse says, to my face, that I'm insane, and they get me on an 4th drip of painkillers that are slightly more powerful than morphine. Then comes the fun part. Turns out, they misjudged my weight and gave me a smidge too much of the painkillers, so within a few minutes I'm higher than the International Space Station. My mom, though worried about me, couldn't stop laughing at my stoned antics, and when I finally came back to Earth the next morning she detailed everything I had said while high. Her favorite is when I asked a nurse to turn the gravity back on, then started singing happy birthday at the top of my lungs. At that point, my mom turned the TV on to try and shut me up, and I became completely mesmerized by Bizarre Foods America. That's when they had to make me drink contrast fluid, and I refused because I'm Catholic. The nurses had to hold me down while my mom squirted a syringe between my top front teeth to get the stuff in me. I was taken in for a CT scan when they got half of the liquid in me and decided that it would have to be done, and I was convinced that the male nurse that was escorting me was Chris Hemsworth. When the CT scan is over and done with, and I'm placed back in front of the TV, the doctor informs my mom that I had a very large ovarian cyst that had ruptured and was the cause of all of my pain, and that she was amazed that I had been conscious the entire time. Normally, when a cyst as large as the one I had ruptured, you would pass out almost instantly. TLDR, right ovary basically exploded. I remained conscious the entire time. Doctors are amazed. This will get buried, and I'm not a doctor, but I can answer for one. My brother passed out at work one day and was rushed to the emergency room. They said his EKG was very off, but his insurance didn't cover him at this specific hospital and he wasn't showing any bad symptoms other than a bad EKG, so they said he needed to see a cardiologist as soon as possible. He made an appointment and got in 2 days later. After running an echo, the doctor said he needed to get to a specialty center as soon as possible. So he drives down to another hospital. They admit him, and he gets a heart catheter. This procedure is where they inject dye into your bloodstream near your heart and take pictures of the flow. Now, he comes out of the OR, and I'm waiting with him in a recovery room while the surgeon looks things over. My brother is high as fuck off of the medicine. The news that awaited us would change everyone's lives. The surgeon walks into the room and starts talking. Now, I'm a fairly educated person, and I have a tendency to really dive into topics, so I ask questions during these types of things. I always do that, and it's done well in some situations. The doctor says that his heart is literally the worst he's seen in an alive person. He's shocked that my brother, other than passing out once, has survived evidently 2 major heart attacks. His heart has an ejection fraction of 5 to 10, basically hardly pushing blood. It's twice the size of a normal heart, and he will need a transplant. On top of that, both of his coronary arteries have not only been clogged, but destroyed. It's been this way for a while, because they are entirely scared. The surgeon said that based on the results, he likely has an extensive capillary network that has allowed certain areas of his heart to survive, because he can't explain it any other way. I was in shock. I mean, my brother was 34 at the time. I could not say a word. It was the only time my mouth was literally hanging open. I felt out of body, like I was looking down on this moment, just to save myself from actually having to experience it. The doctor went on, several times, that he had no idea how he was possibly alive. He wanted me to feel my brother's pulse. There was not one that you could feel at all, not even on his neck. I went out of the room after the surgeon left, sat down in an empty waiting room and just cried, and cried. I managed to call my parents who were halfway across the country on a road trip. It was the hardest call I've ever had to make. I told them to pull over. I didn't care if they were on the interstate, that they just needed to pull over because what I needed to tell them could endanger them if they were driving. So they did. I told my dad, and he couldn't stop saying, "Oh my god." My dad does not use the word God in vain. He didn't cry. My mother had never seen him cry, but he was clearly upset to a degree I had never heard. My mother was tougher. My dad said I needed to tell her, because he couldn't do it. I did, and I could just picture her face. Everyone hates to see their mother crying, and this was no exception. I'm almost glad she was not there. But I told her, and she was just bawling. Couldn't believe it, and they drove from the Grand Canyon to Kansas City overnight. I got lucky with cell phone reception. They were on the outskirts. To hectic months later, months where I feared every time my phone rang expecting news of a sudden heart attack, later expecting emergency hospital trips, experiencing that hospital trip, an induced coma, and a last-minute transplant. He survived. He's a healthy man. I will never forget that horrible moment where the doctor told me it was the worst he's ever seen. Not a doctor, but still an amazing story of how the hell are you alive. I had to make an account just to tell it. A family friend of mine is a retired police officer in Maryland and is missing 3 of his fingers on right hand. I had never asked him about it since I was kid for most of the time I knew him. Finally one day he was over at the house, and I was about 16 to 17 at the time. He and my father were going over dumb things when they were about my age and scars that they had from motorcycle crashes to wounds from Vietnam. Finally my father's friend goes into the story of his wounded hand for me. Back some time ago my father's friend, who we'll call Frank, was a police officer in Maryland for a neighboring county. He was responding to a call of a naked man causing trouble in an IHOP on a busy road fairly near our house. Frank is the first officer to respond. He enters the restaurant finding the naked man on top of a table throwing plates and yelling random things at the staff. Frank talks to the man, and after a hot minute gets him off the table and begins to walk him out of the restaurant as the man appears to have calmed down thanks to Frank's efforts. About 30 feet to the door the man all of a sudden picks up a metal trash can near the door and hits Frank over the head with it. Frank falls to the floor face down in bad shape as the man starts to wail on him with his fists. Frank, on the verge of falling unconscious, places his hands on top of his head in an attempt to defend himself. The naked man pulls out Frank's service revolver, stands over Frank and fires one shot into his skull. The man then wades around the restaurant firing the remaining 5 bullets at staffers, screaming nonsense, thankfully not hitting any of them. The naked man, out of ammo, returns to Frank's body, rolls him over trying to get to his ammo, and in classic movie fashion Frank is waiting with his backup that was strapped to his leg. Frank fires 2 shots into the naked man, piercing the man's heart. The naked man stumbles back, still alive, stumbling towards him. Frank rolls to his side and empties the gun into the naked man's chest, finally bringing him down. Apparently when Frank had put his hands over the back of his head, the bullet hit his knuckles, entered his skull at an angle, and exited the side of his head with no real damage to his brain. Frank lost 3 of his fingers, but has the ability to tell that story to me many years later. Sorry for such a long story, but that's it in a nutshell. The naked man was found to be on PCP. TLDR: cop deflects bullet with his hand, kills the shooter on PCP. My husband has had active protein deficiency for over 20 years and treats it with Calmodin daily. When he was 20 or 21, before his active symptoms started, he raced BMX bikes. Something like that, modified light titanium bikes through obstacle courses. He jumped an obstacle, but didn't see the guy that fell on the other side. Foot got caught in the guy's bike and twisted his leg 270 degrees, snapping his tibia and fibula, and had a full leg and pelvis cast. He kept telling his doctor something didn't feel right and he was in pain. They thought he wanted more painkillers and dismissed it. When they took it off to do a second surgery, they found a clot from his ankle to his hip and the main return vein of his left leg, the one going directly back to his heart. It tore the return valves and rendered them useless, so no circulation occurs in his lower left leg. They were able to break up the clot to save his life, but the damage to his vein is permanent and the symptoms of protein S cannot be cured. He's been having more trouble in the past few years. Had a couple of DVTs and surgery to remove kidney stones was more involved than usual due to blood thinners. Had trouble at work because he couldn't get out of bed some days and his foot would look like a rubber glove blown up. Work gave him a hard time and got fired. Filed discrimination complaint and settled that. He went to a vein specialist that told him they could not place filters because the veins basically rerouted to form smaller channels to bypass the damaged valves. Due to the lack of circulation, a cardiologist recently saw that his iliac vein has basically collapsed and twisted back onto itself, essentially cutting off the flow, and it rerouted around that too, but it's in a small area and the old veins are pushing the new ones together. A stent may help, but surgery will be difficult. The other option is amputation of his leg below his hip. The cardiologist that talked to us after his procedure, I can't remember the name, injected dye and had a full body scan, said it was amazing he had lived this long and could still walk upright. Somewhat he cannot sit or stand for more than 20 to 30 minutes at a time. He said it's a miracle he's lived to be 40, his current age. He is a highly acclaimed cardiac/hematologist/oncologist surgeon and presented my husband's case at a recent conference, getting feedback on how to proceed. He shared the feedback from other doctors and they all asked if the patient was still alive. And disability has denied him initially and in the appeal so far. We are waiting for the actual hearing stage now. It pisses me off so much that I went off on the doctor's NP in the hospital after I asked if she could write his paperwork in the way the attorney asked us to that had the proper language for the disability panel. She said something about him not being disabled, and I went the fuck off on her. I was so frustrated at that point not having people take him seriously. This was not long after his former employer fired him thinking nothing was wrong with him despite his medical records and getting an accommodation. We did not get anyone willing to treat him beyond recommending amputation until we saw this doctor and his GP who understands and is very supportive, but is not a specialist. The GP took his case as a challenge as he never treated anyone with protein deficiency before. He read up on it and went to whatever the equivalent of doctor's professional development is to learn more about it. They are the same age and have somewhat similar backgrounds, therefore a good personal rapport. I'm still worried about him. There are days he cannot stand. I can't do anything about it except help make him comfortable and not have him worry about taking care of the kids too much because walking is painful and causes his leg to go numb. Wow, sorry this was long. I never really talked about it before to anyone. My grandpa has been a practicing physician in Houston, Texas for plus 50 years and has some crazy stories, but this one is one of my favorites. I decided late into my senior year of high school that I wanted to enter into the medical field, and my grandpa was a doctor, so when he came over the day of graduation, I decided to ask him what crazy stuff he's seen in his days. I figured he'd been practicing medicine since about 1963, so he was bound to have a few good stories. Boy was I right. In the 70s, my grandpa worked the graveyard shift as an doctor at a hospital in downtown Houston. Now for those who don't know, like all major cities/metropolitan areas, Houston has some pretty rough neighborhoods, and the one his hospital was near was no exception. He would tell me that there would often be gang fights that would migrate into the parking lot or even sometimes the waiting room itself. It got so bad that the hospital had to have 3 HPD officers guard the waiting room at night so nothing sketchy found its way in. That's enough backstory. Here's where it gets good. This one night a fellow stumbles in with what is obviously a bullet hole in his head, but he was acting very strange in the fact that he was acting, well, normal. He came in, got himself checked in and patiently waited to get called back. When my grandpa was able to take a look, he saw that he had a definite entrance and exit hole in the front and back of his head, which confused Gramps quite a bit because the man didn't seem really fazed at all by the situation. So Gramps asked the man to explain what happened, and this is a basic gist. So he was rolling around with some of his friends and they happened to find themselves in some trouble. One thing led to another and a guy pulled a gun out and shot him in the head from approximately 10 to 15 feet. This baffled my grandpa. How could a guy get shot in the head at such close range and be standing here to tell the tale? So after making sure he was stable, he sent him to get an x-ray of his head, and the results were interesting to say the least. Interesting in the fact that the x-ray showed absolutely no signs of damage to his skull or brain at all. No breaks, no shards of skull, no penetration into the skull cavity, no canal where the bullet would have passed, nothing. He even showed another doctor working the ear to make sure he wasn't going crazy. Nope, still nothing. He and the other doctors in the ear came to this conclusion. The man was shot in the head with the bullet entering at an upward angle, but the bullet itself must have been defective. Yeah, no, something screwed up and didn't add enough powder to the cartridge, so it didn't have very much pop behind it or something like that. So the bullet broke the skin at an upward angle, but didn't have enough force behind it to break the skull. Instead it must have just glanced at it, then traveled all the way up and around his head in the space between the skin and his skull, then exited out the hole in the back. So my gramps went back into the room, slapped a band-aid on the front and back, and told him to have a nice night. Now this very well could have just been my old cookie grandpa pulling my leg, but I still believe it. A good friend of mine was in the passenger seat of a small pickup truck, early 90s Ford Ranger. He's a big guy, center for the small high school football and basketball teams. About 6 feet 6 inches and a trim 300 pounds at the time this happened, just after high school graduation. He was riding with 2 other friends to a barn dance one night in Montana. Guy driving, smallish 18-year-old woman in the center seat. They were going down the highway at 70-ish miles per hour when they hit some black ice at a bend in the road. The car goes flying off the highway and into a field, where it hits and starts flipping end over end and every which way. He said he could see sky, then ground, then sky, then ground, out the windshield in front of him, and he thinks it was 5 or 6 front flips in the car before it came to rest upright. My big buddy was almost completely doubled over by how much the cab was smashed all around him. His first thought was, I'm being squished, I have to get out of here. He pushed his door open with a mighty heave and it sort of swung open and dangled, nearly falling off. The interior lights of the car came on, and, as he was doubled over and mostly looking down, he was very confused to see the girl's head poking out from under the car beneath him. He reached to his left and indeed, she wasn't there. He carefully pulled himself out of the car and tried his best to check on her, but he couldn't move the truck, and she was mostly under it. She was breathing and unconscious. He would later learn that what police believe happened is that she wasn't wearing her seatbelt and she was somehow ejected backward out the rear window. The front windshield was shattered, but still in place, then struck by the bed or tailgate as the car flipped forward and thus launched forward in the air. They don't know how far because they don't know at what point she was ejected. It was a freakish coincidence that the car ended up landing on her. Amazingly, all 3 of them survived. Girl was a mess, broken arm, leg, ribs, back, and a long list of internal injuries like punctured lung and damage to her kidneys and stomach. Driver was unconscious because he had hit his head hard enough to fracture his skull and spent a few days in a coma and had a few surgeries before he came out with the usual symptoms from a head injury, memory loss, impaired motor function. At the time I heard the story, it had been a year and he was close to full coordination again, etc. My friend, he had a 3-inch shallow cut on his arm from where he cut it on a protruding piece of metal while pulling himself out of the car. Also, he was really sore for a week. As this was the early 90s, they didn't have a cell phone, so he had run from the scene of the accident about a mile until he got to the first farmhouse to call for help. Then he ran back. He says he was jacked on adrenaline and somehow didn't think to ask the farmer for a ride. So when the ambulance arrived and he flagged them down on the highway and led them into the field and started explaining what happened, they started attending to the guy and girl and the paramedics said, "Okay young man, thanks, you can return to your car now." They thought he was a passerby because how the hell could he have walked away from a crash like this? TLDR friend walks away with barely a scratch from a terrifically violent car crash that nearly killed the other 2 passengers. EMTs arriving on scene assume he was just a witness. When the paramedics got there, they I've told this story before, but disclaimer that my father isn't a doctor, rather he was a paramedic, and one of the best in the southeast region at one point. This is the story of a nearly unkillable man, or a really lucky one at least. My father had a lot of frequent flyers in his time, some of which were of course suicide attempts, but there was one guy that took it to the next level and back, I would say. When someone tries suicide and fails, it tends to have an effect on their life. They either get it right the next time, or they turn things around from their near-death experience. Seldom does someone tend to fail more than twice, much less more than 15 times. That's right, this man failed his suicide attempts more than 15 times. When this guy attempted suicide the first time, he wanted something quiet, so he tried pills. Pills suck for suicides. They hardly ever work, and when they do their work it hurts like a beach. The guy ended up not being able to kill himself, and instead writhing in pain, while my father hauled him into the emergency room, treating him for large-scale overdoses of multiple meds. Then there was the times after that where he attempted suicide by hanging. The first time he tried to use a rope and the rope broke. The second attempt, the cord tore out of the ceiling that was holding it, leaving him free to flop like a fish out of water. Hard to commit suicide when you are wiggling around gasping for air. He ended up being seen and having the medics called. This pattern went on with many different attempts. Why didn't he jump off a building? He tried that 2 times and landed on cars both times, which ended up cushioning his fall somehow. The guy misjudged the first jump and it wasn't high enough, only resulting in a bunch of broken bones. The second one, a car was driving under him and he didn't compensate for it, meaning the car was moving. He rolled off it and ended up taking reduced damage. He needed surgery after both, however, so it wasn't like he came away fully unscathed. This guy's passing by on the skin of his teeth. The one that really got my father was the last one though, the gun attempt. Usually placing a gun to the head and pulling the trigger is a pretty damn good way to assure your demise. Not this guy. The dingus didn't know lick about guns and bought a low caliber pistol. Between the low caliber, the inability to hold it properly and at the right angle, and the fact that he never shot one before, the bullet ended up going off target slightly. This meant that instead of piercing the skull and thereby the brain, the bullet traveled through the skin, glancing off the skull, but because of the low velocity due to its caliber, the thing continued under the skin and atop the cranium, creating a skinning-like tunnel all the way to the other side of the man's head, where it stopped and proceeded to ensure the worst headache of this poor fella's life. Dad shows up and sees what has happened, and upon instruction by some very trusting doctors, cuts it out from under the skin as they travel to the hospital. These doctors worked with my father for a very long time, and he probably could have pulled off some of the surgeries that they did for trauma. He wasn't going to hurt this guy by doing something as small as removing a flesh-wound bullet. TLDR, man attempts suicide 15 plus times and fails every time, including a gunshot wound to the head and jumping off buildings. To any who wonder, the guy was doing fine last we checked in on him and had managed to start his own business, which was booming in the local area. He also had gotten married and had a kid. He no longer desired to commit suicide and had turned his life around. Dad considered saving his as a great victory for his career, since he got to see the fruits of it firsthand for a change. Not a doctor, had paramedics come to the scene of my car accident, drove a car that had a bizarre new safety feature that has since been removed because of incidences like this, especially in Canada, where if your tire breaks contact with the ground even a millimeter, your engine cuts the gas, therefore the car shuts off. You have nothing to stop the car with now, at least not correctly. The town had flooded, and I was trying to get back home, and was about 100 feet from my house when suddenly I just hit a puddle, engine shut off, and the car went out of control. I'm very lucky I was going quite slow, but regardless I slammed into a rock about 4 feet tall, flipping nose over tail, took out about 3 to 4 trees, and spun into someone's front yard. The people never called an ambulance, in fact they called the police to try and get me arrested. The police showed up and called an ambulance as the car was flipping. It was insane. Light and dark all within seconds. The back doors were ripped open. I was smashed in the back of the head by this really heavy brass lamp. Was repairing as a birthday gift for a friend. Still have concussed headaches 3 years later. And never passed out. Once it stopped I smelled smoke, so I thought the engine might be on fire, but my door was crushed shut. The whole engine block had been crushed toward me by about a foot, so I was stuck inside. I managed to get my legs up, smash the door with my legs, and I grabbed my phone and purse before running for the trees in case it burst into flame again. Neighbors didn't call 911, but came to watch. Cop shows up, immediately starts filing a report, and says it was my fault, and lies in the report. EMS shows up and immediately elbows this guy out of the way, a younger man and older one. The older one goes stark white as I'm sitting in the driver's seat of my crushed car, eating crackers I had as a snack, and drinking a juice box I had packed. They both insisted I go to the hospital, and every few seconds frantically were insisting I shouldn't even be standing, conscious, or possibly alive. I declined as I had to take care of getting a rental car, insurance, towing, and the police. My parents refused to come. I was about 17 at the time. Got a call from the dealer I had it towed to as it was registered to me. The man on the other line started to cry because he thought I was dead for sure. Got the same response when I went to go collect my things I left inside the car. My doctor, I visited a few days later, said I had some type of minor internal bleeding likely from the seatbelt, cracked some ribs, concussed, torn trapezius, and was not pleased I was already driving and continuing my life again. Not a doctor, but when I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes I think my nurses were wondering how I was conscious even. I don't know how close I was to dying in reality though. I was about 20 years old at the time and I started to feel a bit sick. None of our family had any clue what diabetes was always like, so none of us knew the symptoms. Anyway, since I was feeling sick I decided I'd drink some orange juice in an attempt to get better. One symptom of high blood sugar is that you pee a lot and you are endlessly thirsty, as your body is thinking you will drink water and you will flush the excess sugars out that way. I didn't have water, I had sugar-filled orange juice, about a gallon of the stuff. Later that day I was feeling much worse, so my parents decided it was time to see my doctor. We go in, and I'm barely conscious, a lot of tunnel vision, where I'm awake and aware, but can't see well. Doctor has a hunch on what it is, and tests my blood sugar. The meter that he had didn't go high enough for how high my blood sugar was. The doctor says that I need to go to the ER as soon as possible, so my dad rushes me over to the ER where they check my blood sugar, and it was well over 1200 mg/dl, well over 66.6 mol/L, if you are more familiar with that. The nurses had never seen a blood sugar that high before. I was in the hospital for like a week, and my eyeballs had swollen because of the blood sugar getting to them, so I was essentially blind for a long time after that. I had lost a ton of weight too. I'm 6 feet tall, and I was down to 115 pounds or so. Most of that weight loss was water weight from me peeing all the time. I'm not a doctor, but story. Guy I work with has some kind of cancer, colon I think. I don't know the guy that well, but he tells this story to anyone that will listen. I'd say he's in his early 50s. Earlier this year he was not at work for a few months. I didn't think much of it as some of the guys out on the floor are only temp workers. They will come and go every few months with a lot of them eventually coming back through again. Well, this guy showed up again a couple months ago back to work, but I noticed he was taking a lot of rest breaks but nobody was giving him any sheet for it, which is odd. Now I just work for the same company. I'm not a direct co-worker or boss of his, so I'm not saying anything to the guy, but one day I walked past him and just asked how things were going. He lays his whole story on me. He's had cancer for a while, and before he left work earlier in the year he would literally be leaving work some days, getting chemo, then coming in again the next day. Due to work requirements he had to come back to work, or risk losing his insurance. His wife is disabled and can't work at all, so he has to work, he tells me. During his absence he continued chemo until at one point he was put into the death room at the hospital, where they only put patients near death. It apparently has a small chapel in the room and your family can come and stay as long as they want. His organs were shutting down, and he was given 2 hours to live. Somehow he made it past the 2-hour mark and his organs were regaining their functions. They moved him back into intensive care after that night and eventually discharged him with no signs of cancer. Guy pulls down his pants a ways, and he is essentially mummy wrapped from the balls to his navel. Says he has a huge ass hole in him now that's scabbing over from his colostomy bag removal, and that for the first couple weeks you could see into him and view his intestines and sheet. I have no idea how this guy is still showing up at work now with such a positive outlook on everything. I guess being told you're so close to death with all your family essentially mourning for you already puts a lot of things into perspective. I had a patient in my first month in the emergency room that jumped off of a 50-foot bridge and landed right on his head in the dirt. The patient was awake, but not moving his arms or legs and definitely had been imbibing for some time before the fall. I'm a first-year resident and my senior, for the purposes of this story, we'll call him Dr. Fingers, is doing the exam, while I and another second-year resident help roll him. During any trauma you have to check for equal tone, which means you have to digitally examine the poop chute to see if it tightens around your finger. Dr. Fingers tells the patient what he's about to do, and the patient starts swearing up a storm saying, "If you put your finger up my ass, I'm going to kick your little sob." He wasn't happy, but he also didn't notice when Dr. Fingers defiled him not once, but twice for good measure with no rectal tone. Effectively, this guy was paralyzed. We then sent him to scan his entire spine and the rest of his body too, which all came back negative. So we were thoroughly baffled. We were sure this dude was going to have a fractured cervical spine, but he had butt kiss. Meanwhile, we are at our computers and we hear a commotion from the trauma room. We got up thinking that he might have some rowdy visitors and were amazed to find the guy sitting straight up in bed. Not only that, but he was again cussing up a storm and calling the nurses every name he could think of. Fast forward 2 hours later, the guy makes a complete recovery, threatens to kill my senior resident and walks out of the hospital. He is the luckiest man I've ever met. Nurse here. One day when I was a nursing student in my last clinical placement, before graduating my teacher gave me only one patient assignment for the day. I was very caught off guard, because most of my classmates were taking 3 to 4 patients. Fast forward a couple minutes, and I'm reading this guy's chart. He literally had over 20 diagnoses. That's when I was thinking, like, oh, these are probably all old issues that are under control. Nope. I took this guy's vital signs, heart rate, blood pressure, respiration rate, blood oxygen levels and temperature. He was totally asymptomatic and was talking fine, and then the vital sign machine beeps and alarms start going off and I look. His heart rate was at 60 BPM and his blood pressure was 60/30. The normal is 120/80. His cardiovascular system was so faked up he'd have periods of cyanosis, blue-ish tint to skin/lips/fingers/etc. that he'd become navy blue all over. I had this patient for multiple weeks and came to like him, although he was a handful. A couple weeks later they decided to give him a FIM-POP bypass, which is where they like to simply make a shunt or alternative route for blood to bypass a blockage in an artery, and these are 2 of the biggest arteries in the human body. So first time getting him out of bed after surgery with the physio, and after the doctor had just seen him and given the okay, he's doing fine, no dizziness or anything, so we get him up. He stands up and instantly there's blood all over the floor. I'm like trying not to freak out, because you never want to scare patients. I'll admit I wasn't doing a great job at staying calm. Lol. We got him in bed and we called for help, and thank heaven my teacher was first to come in. She was a veteran nurse from a cardiology emergency department, and to this day, is the most competent nurse I've ever seen. She sees what is happening and runs out of the room, grabs 2 abdominal dressings, basically like 3x6 pads of gauze with non-stick cover, and folds them into a thick about 2-inch wide bundle, and literally puts all her weight on the incision site. Turns out the guy's stitches on his arteries had blown. The required emergency surgery and actually survived. Big discussion with MDs happened after, and they were like, how the fuck is this guy alive? Oh yeah. After the surgery he had a central venous access device and also huge dressings on his legs that constantly were oozing, requiring dressing changes every hour or so because they got soaked through. He developed a systemic infection. Again, he survived that. I was born 3 weeks early, on itself not the greatest problem, but my mother's pregnancy had not been the best, with me trying to get out months earlier, her being in a car crash, and more general complications. My mother surviving my birth was a miracle in the first place, then she didn't get a blood transfusion, so she basically didn't recover from it for something like a year, all while not having enough blood to technically be able to handle that. That together would be miracles enough, if you ask me, but nope. Something like 2 to 3 months later I was back in a university hospital thingy. I was really small, but seemed to be fine at first, but as it turned out the muscles that were supposed to allow me to breathe were horribly underdeveloped. I regularly literally became blue due to not getting enough oxygen. Again, something I technically shouldn't have been able to survive, which doctors still can't explain, as it wasn't just my muscles that sucked, but also my ability to control them. I could barely exert any force from my muscles until something like 14 or so. According to logic, I wasn't able to breathe enough, and should have died in my sleep somewhere the first week or two if I went to lay wrong. As it turns out, baby me really liked to lie on one side, which almost led to my skull getting deformed. My parents had to basically lock me the other way around to counteract that, and really still should have had significant brain damage due to the absurdly low amount of oxygen I got. They think that, ironically, my earlier complications actually saved my life, as due to me being so small, when I was born my body needed just that tiny bit of oxygen less that allowed me to pull though until my muscles actually did develop to the point where I could breathe and eat normally. Long story short, I don't know who the fuck I'm alive right now, with all the stuff that happened during my mother's pregnancy and my birth that all by all normal common sense should have ended my life, not as flashy as many other tales, but not any less of a miracle according to all the medical documents. Working in natural history museums, I have seen collections of items removed from human bodies, and in many cases these items should have killed the patient but didn't. I mostly saw items that were swallowed, either due to pica disorder or some medical disorders, but some people inserted things in other orifices. I have seen surgical collections of the following items swallowed by adult individuals: thumbtacks, sewing needles, push pins, safety pins, small stones and rocks, and in most cases, they were mixed collections. In all cases these weren't 1 or 2 sharp items, they were piles of them. That's what surgeons donate to museums. Big shocking things. Light bulbs, glass shards, electric wires, full sets of cutlery, small bottles, masses of cotton balls, you name it, and somebody out there has eaten them by the tens or hundreds, and survived long enough to have them surgically removed. There was an increased post-surgical mortality rate in the older collections, which went back until the early 20th century, maybe a little earlier. Don't even get me started on the trichobosaurs. Those are pretty gross. But far and away the most shocking thing I ever saw was a pile of faking razor blades. Some gentleman decades ago had consumed an entire box of the razor blades in use back then, one at a time, and he lived. The esophagus is host to some large blood vessels. You nick one, and you could bleed out very quickly. You slice your esophagus into a million pieces with a handful of razor blades, and it doesn't matter what century you live in. You're going to die. But not this dude. I don't know what circumstances caused him to seek medical attention. I'm guessing it was all the blood he was throwing up, because he sliced his stomach quite a bit. But there, among the collections of things people had eaten that should not be eaten, was a pile of rusty razor blades and a few insane faking x-rays. The man survived surgery. However, there was a note with the collection that stated that he had died several years ago from an esophageal hemorrhage following the consumption of, I think, glass shards. An 18-year-old male transported via ambulance to the hospital, shot straight through the throat and twice in the chest. I think the cop said it was a .38, but really don't remember. The bullet in the throat missed the jugular, carotid, and spinal column, and the chest bullets were similarly impotent. The throat bullet entered just next to his left carotid and was bulging out of the back of his neck, but did not exit. After stabilization and prep for the police officer who accompanied the bullet-riddled teen asked the kid who shot him. The kid replied, "I'm not ratting out my friends." The cop was justifiably bitter about this, because his partner had been shot and killed the previous year, while this 18-year-old survived, being shot in the neck and chest. Another time, male in his mid-20s brought it. Cops had been investigating a drug deal and heard gunfire in the area. They found the patient shot 7 times. EMS brought him in, and he coded while on the elevator from the ambulance bay into the resuscitation unit. The fast, focused assessment with sonography revealed massive internal bleeding, and after some external defibrillation, we cracked his chest with a thoracotomy. 2 of the bullets had passed through his heart. The trauma resident and fellow stitched the bullet holes, and we did internal defib and epinephrine injections for about 10 minutes after. Eventually, we thought it had pretty much turned into a teaching case for the medical students on ATLS protocols. We're a large teaching hospital, and that there was no chance he'd come back, but of course he did. Wheeled him off to the, or leaving a 200-foot trail of blood from his stretcher. The cleaning techs loved us that day. ATLS equals advanced trauma life support. Not quite the same, but my friend told me a story about his days with the local ambulance service. And this woman was sure she would have a story like some of these. Damn every other medical professional in the scene. It was a call about a vehicle/semi collision. 2 sedans had crashed head on, while the semi tried to skirt out of the way. One of the cars, I think a convertible, had ended up going most of the way under the semi's trailer. My friend goes to the half car to check in the driver and discovers, in the back seat, the head of the man who had been in the front. That is a bad place for a head to be, I'm told. He relays the message and addresses the other drivers, one mildly stunned, and the other with just a concussion. This is a small road, so, with the mess, traffic is entirely stopped and this woman, still in scrubs, runs up to the accident. I can help. I can help. I'm a nurse. She starts flocking towards a car with a semi atop it. My friend, being a gentleman, tries to stop her. Ma'am, that man is dead. There is nothing we can do. He didn't want her to have to see just a head, dude. But she's a brat, so you're not qualified to make that call. You're not a doctor. At which point, shrug, alright then hun. A few moments later, she comes back, pale. You could have told me that you were dead, and got back in her car. Not a doctor, but there was a somewhat apocryphal story that was passed down from my mom's side of the family about my great-grandmother when she was a little girl. When she was about 7 years old, she and her sister were playing a game where they dangled strings in the fireplace. Then when the end caught on fire, they'd twirl it around in the air to watch the pattern the ember made, because that's apparently what you did for fun when you were a little kid in the Depression era. Well, at one point she twirled it wrong, and the string wrapped around her dress and caught it on fire. Thankfully, it was the middle of winter, so her dad picked her up and threw her into the snow outside and was able to put her out. They called the doctor and he came by and basically said she was too badly burned and all he could do was basically give her enough drugs that she'd just go to sleep and never wake up. Her mom beached him out, saying that she wasn't going to let him leave until he did his damnedest to keep her alive. So the doctor basically just emptied his medical bag on her, using whatever he could to help keep her alive. She not only lived, but she only had one scar from the ordeal, a long one that went from the inside of her arm and down her side, where her skin had fused together, and they had to cut apart. Another I'm not a doctor but story. Sorry op. When I was 3, I was waiting for my grandma to pick me up from daycare. She'd gone to the shops prior and was late. It turned out that she'd had a stroke whilst driving, and in the process, crashed into a tree. Luckily, a doctor was driving right behind her and managed to get her out of the car and resuscitate her. And luckily, she ended up in a coma with a crushed hip, or something to that extent, and a very high likelihood of brain damage if she were to wake up. After a few weeks of being in a coma, my mum and aunt decided it was time to pull the plug on her life support as there was no sign of her coming to. My mum took me to the hospital as she felt I should be able to say goodbye. Children weren't meant to be in the area my grandma was staying in, so mum basically snuck me in. When we got to my grandma, I said my goodbyes. I don't remember much of this whole thing, so this is based on what my family told me, and as we were leaving, she sat up and said, "You're not getting rid of me that easily." She woke up and made a full physical recovery, with the exception of needing a fake hip which gave her a fair bit of trouble, but it was a slow process mentally. I moved overseas not too long after that and went to visit once a year. She never realized I'd grown and was convinced 7-year-old me was still 3. It actually took her 2 years to even fully process that I left. Now, 17 years later, she's still totally self-sufficient, happy, and healthy. She would have certainly died had there not been a doctor driving behind her that day, and it's incredible that she made a full recovery given how low the chances seemed to be. Not a doctor, but sort of a medical miracle. In January 2009, I had a miscarriage. That alone sucks, but at the time, I was stuck on, I'm losing the baby, not getting to the part where I was bleeding out. My bedroom, bathroom, hallway, and front entrance looked like multiple murders had occurred. I walked to the ambulance unassisted, they put me on the monitors, and I started to catch on that something was wrong when my blood pressure reading made the EMT furrow her brow and mutter, "That can't be right." We went from a rather slow pace to absolutely flying. Arrived at her still conscious and speaking, albeit slowly and a bit slurred. BP and Tridge, registered at 60/30. The Tridge nurse and 2 doctors asked me, "How are you still awake?" I think it's because I normally have low BP, and that allowed my body to cope with what was just a severe version of its normal. Multiple transfusions later, good as new. A year before that, I had a leak in my spinal sheath caused by an epidural. The hospital absolutely refused to believe that I had a CSF leak and discharged me to go home without ever checking for one. I had a series of small seizures, a stroke, and a series of grand mal seizures, including another seizure in the or while they were trying to repair the leak. Any of those could have, and due to the overall weakness of just having had a baby and then dealing with a pretty bad CSF leak for 4 days, should have killed me. The doctor that repaired the leak told me, "Either you are very lucky, or I'm very talented, since you didn't have a single thing working in your favor." I've also had antibiotic-resistant pneumonia, 2 heart attacks, multiple potentially life-threatening traumas, including a stabbing in the stomach, multisystemic organ failure, and septicemia. I'm pretty sure I'm pretty much immortal. I'm a doctor, but unfortunately a PhD, not an MD. Sorry, I can't sign any prescriptions for you. Anyway, this one is about my husband. He started having these spells. He would pass out, fall over like a fell tree. Sometimes he would act as if he were on another planet, be totally out of it, and loopy for a few minutes. We had a CT scan the first time it happened, and were told the symptoms were stroke-like, but no evidence of a stroke. He would then have these spells off and on for 2 or 3 months, and then they would go away for a few months. Then they came back, only with new and interestingly worse symptoms added on each time. We went through 4 different neurologists in 2 years without any definitive diagnosis. Finally got pissed and said enough with the neurologists and went to an internal medicine specialist. He told us he learned more trying to figure out what was wrong with my husband than he remembered from med school, but we were still at an impasse after 3 months when my husband started losing feeling down his right side. It got to the point that he closed his arm in 3 doors on his way to the doctor's office the day he finally ended up in the hospital. Doc admitted him through the ER and had the first CT scan in 2 years. Amazingly enough, there was a mass the size of a large grape in his brain. He was referred to the large teaching hospital in the state for brain surgery, where we were told it was either the same kind of tumor that killed Dr. Green on ER or an abscess. If it was the tumor, he had a 50/50 shot of surviving, but an abscess was easy. Due to our arrival at the end of the week, my husband's other pre-existing health condition, and doctors not bothering to ask us about it, the surgeon put off his surgery until Tuesday of the next week. In the meantime, he was on 2 strong antibiotics and an antifungal just in case and steroids. By the time they did the surgery and found out it actually was an abscess, they couldn't culture anything to determine what caused it. He had to be on antibiotics and antifungal for 10 weeks by PICC line to be sure they had killed whatever caused the abscess. The kicker? The infectious disease folks came by and told us there was no way the abscess could have caused his symptoms for 2 years. He would have been dead a long time ago. Only problem with that is, his symptoms completely disappeared after the surgery. TLDR weird neurological symptoms for 2 years. Brain abscess found and removed. Symptoms disappear, but abscess couldn't possibly cause them. Yeah right. Self story. I was 3 or 4 years old, in the front passenger side of the car. It was a camera I think. Yeah I know, one of those rattle trap coffins. I was wearing the seatbelt wrong because it irritated my neck. I put the chest belt behind myself. Still wearing the lap belt parts fine. Our light had turned green, but my dad was distracted talking to me about something dumb. I had wanted to go home because I was getting car sick. He was assuring me we were almost done with chores. Basically, we were stopped for a little while with the light green. A big white truck from oncoming pulled up to the left turn lane to cross over towards our right and stopped. My dad realized the light had turned green and started to go when suddenly the white truck from oncoming squealed its tires and rammed us. I swear to this day it was intentional. I woke up from the noise of a machine near my right side and the car door being pulled away by an EMT who started talking loudly to try to get my attention as he put a neck brace on me. I remember crying that my legs hurt really badly and being strapped onto a stretcher. They wrapped something over me that felt tape-like in intervals to keep me from moving. The car apparently reacted like a pinball and spun around the intersection, making a recorded total of 38.75 complete rotations, only having been stopped by another vehicle in a different direction. Barely a scratch for their car. We had hit 2 different light poles in the intersection. The airbags did not deploy. I needed 12 stitches on each side of my hip because the lap belt angled into me during the crash and became the only thing stopping me from going out the windshield. I don't remember anything after seeing the truck ram us because my head hit the dashboard and I had a concussion with suspected traumatic brain injury. Technology wasn't really good enough at that time to be sure of the exact severity. I suffer terrible, fading vision ever since, short-term memory failure / problems, PTSD, and some other side effects from the damage. My hips healed fine. I have a neat scar now. If I had worn my seatbelt properly, it probably would have cut my neck open. So, my girlfriend went to R&D after having mild abdominal pain from morning until about 1 PM, gradually getting a little worse. So they run some tests, give her morphine and bundle her into a high dependency ambulance. Off to the main hospital we go as the one with the R&D isn't equipped to deal. It was late at night. They were waiting for the ward doctor to come to see if they should send her for scans or whatnot. Bear in mind this has been hours and the fact she had to have morphine suggested it was serious, but all we'd been told at the R&D hospital was maybe her appendix, maybe a kidney infection, which didn't sound too bad. So, she's waiting and not being seen until she vomits, which is a surprise, as she's been unable to do so for absolute years until this point. So the nurses look panicked, get everything cleaned up. My girlfriend is just like I'm sorry, I don't like making a mess, and offers to help them clean up, while shivering. Tests eventually get done, and at this point, her kidneys are shutting down. She's gone into sepsis and they also happen to see that she'd been misdiagnosed as type 2 diabetic when she is actually type 1. She's on hourly jobs for blood pressure, heart rate, and they've got a catheter in to check urine flow. They're checking sugars and taking blood samples every 2 or 3 hours. She's on an insulin pump and around 4 other antibiotic bags. They're totally flushing her system out. Within 24 hours, the nurses seem a bit timid coming in, asking how she's feeling. They seem really worried. She's like, I've not been in pain since I was sick. Could I have a sandwich? Not a whole one, though. I'd like to go home. It's after this that the ward doctor comes around and explains the severity of what happened and the fact she needs to be on OBS for a few days, maybe a week, and perhaps pills afterwards for her kidney, but she needs to stay just in case. They seemed to be sure she'd have another bout of kidney failure, I think. They never admitted to it, but why else were the staff so grim coming in? I have 2. Patient said he was robbed at gunpoint at a Taco Bell, gave the guy the money, but was still shot in the face. Guy took a .40 caliber bullet right beside his nose, which hit his first cervical vertebrae, shattered it, ricocheted off it, entered the back of his throat and he swallowed it. Guy was talking and acting just fine. Turns out he robbed a party store and shot the store clerk who shot him in return. Another guy came in with 9 bullets in him from a police shootout, took 2 in the abdomen, 2 in one arm, 2 in the legs and 3 in the face. One went through his orbits and blew out both eyes. One went from his jaw and lodged in his neck. Another one went in right next to his nose. This guy was all sorts of faked up. I remember one of the face wounds started squirting blood as we were giving him a quart and a nurse had to go in and put a towel over it. We took him to surgery to look for the damage the bullet did to his intestines. The guy didn't have one hole in his guts or the tissue around it. Both bullets lodged in the back body wall right next to his spinal column. It was nuts. Nobody could believe it. Edit. Bullet was 40 calories, not 40 millimeters. Not a doctor, but I ask myself how my brother is still alive and functioning normally today. About 3 years ago, my bro was about to leave for a trip to Costa Rica, venture out into the jungle alone, and camp for about a week. So it's early in the morning at PHL, and he passes out in the middle of the floor, about an hour before he was about to board. The employees of the nearby service desk thought he was a crazy homeless dude and threatened to call the cops on him. Luckily, a passerby has the heart to help, calls my dad 911, and he is saved by the fact that he happened to be in the absolute best place. Turns out his intestines were essentially twisted at birth, and he was a ticking time bomb for this to happen. I say this is the best place because I have many doubts a local hospital could have saved him. Being in Philly with some of the best surgeons gave him much higher chances. Not only this, but had he been out camping alone in Costa Rica, it would have been a slow grueling death. To make his case even crazier, about a year ago, he was driving back from an interview about 3 hours from home. He fell asleep at the wheel on the highway, completely totaled his car, flips and all, and he walked out with just a few scratches. To top all this off, the doctor had told him that after his surgery, he could have become paralyzed, and it was very likely he wouldn't be able to eat by himself ever again. And here we are today. Dude is carrying himself around like nothing happened. Lives a normal life, eats what he wants, lifts at the gym, you name it. Completely bewildered that he's even alive after that, especially with no adverse effects. I don't know if anyone will be able to read this, not a doctor but a patient. I think it happened when I was 18 and I was skating with my buddy at an open skating rink late at night 2 am-ish. I was going by so fast since there were like 8 people skating. I happened to bump into someone that's around 6'6" tall, 250-pound guy and hit the back of my head. I literally just went blackout, and it felt like I was unconscious for an hour or so. My friend said it was only a few seconds when I fell, and I was unresponsive, so he shook me. I woke up with a headache, feeling tired, so we decided to go back home. I was fine for a couple of days until the 3rd or 4th day, when I just got home from work and decided to hit the bed. I remember turning my head to the other side and my world literally just spun to the point I yelled for my brother to call 911. They tested me for a CT scan, or MRI, and a lot of tests. Turns out there was a blood clot in my head and was slowly bleeding. The doctor said it was so severe that I had to stay at the hospital for a few weeks. They said I was very lucky and stupid because I did not go straight to the hospital. Those few weeks, I did not remember shit, start seeing stars, and never go to sleep when you suddenly feel sleepy and call the nurse. It was funny because the first few days after the accident, I was just sleeping like a baby. The following months were hell. I was on my lowest state of mind and was severely depressed to the point I started having suicide thoughts because of the side effects. Eye pointy, sudden memory loss, forgetting everything, headaches, spinning world/vision, dizziness, short temper. The doctor said it might stay for years, but I'm doing fine now. It was hell. A few years ago I was living in Colorado Springs. My husband and I had just bought a Jeep, and I was learning to drive. One day my husband was having extreme tooth pain at work. I worked with him at the time, and was the only person who would be able to get him medicine from a coworker up the street. I felt really uncomfortable about going for some reason, and begged him to let someone else go. He was in major pain, and pleaded with me to go. I agreed and drove to the gas station to fill the tank before going to the coworker's house. After I was done filling up, I got in the car and started driving away without putting on my seatbelt. Usually I was super paranoid about seatbelts being worn at all times, but this time I decided it was okay. I started to drive away when I got an overwhelming feeling of dread and a little voice in my head told me that I needed to put on my seatbelt. I pulled over, put on my seatbelt, and got back onto the road, turned onto the highway, and less than a mile down the road I took a left-hand turn on a green light. I did not know that I had to yield, and I thought the cars on the other side of the road had stopped. They weren't. I was taking the turn and all of a sudden everything around me started flying around, sheet flying off the dashboard, from the backseat, the middle console, everywhere. The sound was so loud, I couldn't compute what was going on. I had no idea what to do, so I just closed my eyes and covered my face with my hands. I must have blacked out, because when I opened my eyes I was hanging upside down by my seatbelt. The passenger side was smashed completely and there was just an absence of sound. It was so terrifying. I looked out my window and people were running up to my car asking if I was okay. One woman was screaming at me that I ran a red light. The only thing I could say was it was green. It was green. I had been hit by an outgoing 65 on my passenger side front wheel well, causing me to happen. I did a full 360 and was then hit again on that same wheel well by a van going the same speed, causing me to flip. I walked away with a cut on my tongue from biting it, a cut on my eyelid, and some major seatbelt bruises, and of course the knowledge that a green light on a left-hand turn means to yield. I have not learned to drive yet, but I'm trying. The doctor said that I probably didn't break any bones because I was relaxed when I got hit. If I had not put on my seatbelt I would have surely died in that accident. Edit. I haven't learned to drive yet because I'm trying to overcome the major fear of the road. I had some major panic attacks just as a passenger for a while after, and still get stressed in scary situations, which are only scary to me, like thinking a car is going to merge into us for no reason. I'm trying though. I'm not a doctor, but I was the first person with any medical knowledge to get to him. I was at a party, and I was talking to a girl when a friend of mine runs in and grabs me. He says that someone fell off the roof and landed headfirst by the pool. I told him to calm down and call the coroner. He said you don't get it. He's still alive. I took off at a dead sprint and yelled at him, you should have led with that. When I got there the guy was sitting up and his skull was hanging open. Like literally, his skull. The bone plate was hanging off to the side and you could see a lot of brain and a lot of blood. Everyone was just standing there dumbfounded. I told a guy to call 911. I asked the guy who fell how he was feeling, and he said he had a headache. I just kinda stared at him for a while, then told him that I honestly didn't know how he was alive and that all we could really do was wait for the ambulance. I'm equipped for bones breaking, cuts, and wounds, but not brain things. I asked him what happened, and he said he tried to jump into the pool and missed. The ambulance showed up, and the EMT had just about the same reaction I did. They loaded him up and took him off to the hospital. A few weeks later we were cleaning out the pool. There had been a lot of blood in it, plus other bits, and I asked my friend, who was the one who came and got me, how the guy was doing. He said he has some brain damage, and he may have to wear a helmet for the rest of his life, but survived it. According to him the cocktail of drugs he was on saved him. Not a doctor, but a story about my grandmother. She was born in 1923 in a tiny little town in the Midwestern US. She had a large cyst on her spine. The decision was made to remove it, even though they thought she might die. She survived but had some paralysis of her left leg that even grew to be 2 inches shorter than the right. She grew up completely normally, rode a bike, played football with her brothers, and graduated from high school, wearing a brace on her leg the whole time. She married, had 3 kids, and renovated a 100-year-old house by herself, including painting the exterior, twice. In the 1970s she had a kidney infection that destroyed her kidney on the left side and ended up having it removed. She had an unexpected allergic reaction, and between that and what they found when they did her surgery, they realized she had spina bifida and that it didn't appear in her medical records. At age 50, she and the rest of her family found out that the cyst on her back was a lot more than a cyst, and that she had survived a birth defect that had a less than 1% survival rate at the time she was born. Even at the time of her kidney surgery in the 70s the survival rate was about 10%. Eater, just in case anyone is curious, she died just a few years ago, only a couple of months shy of her 90th birthday. Respiratory therapist in a level 1 trauma/ICU here. Had an old blind guy fall down a 3rd floor elevator shaft in a dodgy inner city hotel. He comes in talky yelling and fighting us all. His initial labs were fairly normal, just some moderate trauma, rib FXs and I believe a long bone FX. He was admitted from our ed to our transitional ICU floor unit. He had an acute mental status change early one morning the next day and became unarousable. He snapped out of it when a code was called to intubate him, and we held off momentarily. We drew labs and that's when the weird sheet started. His blood pH was 6.76 where norms are 7.35-7.45. Anything under 7.20 is considered a critical value. By all accounts this guy should not be conscious, much less yelling at me to go fuck myself. His CO2 levels were normal, was not tachypneic, so whatever was making him acidotic was not respiratory related. We left him alone for a bit, transferred him to the ICU, and after his mental status kept going up and down like a roller coaster, we intubated him. Come to find out, he drank a decent amount of antifreeze and was probably set up, then pushed into an elevator shaft. After about a month in the ICU, on CVVH, prone positioning beds, NMBAs and all the pressers we could throw at him, he passed. I'll always wonder, if we didn't intubate him, if he would have rode it out. Edit. Values. A med student here. Just last week saw an 80-something-year-old patient at a GP, primary care, clinic who came in with a new lump in his neck, enlarged lymph nodes on examination. The GP said the patient had come in the previous week with the neck lump. It had appeared pretty much overnight, so he prescribed him some antibiotics in the hope it was just a primary infection of the lymph nodes, but they didn't do anything, so he now ordered an ultrasound, suspicious of cancer. The patient was like, by the way, I've had some chest pain for the past 12 hours, so after asking questions and determining it was probably cardiac pain, arranged an ECG and urgent troponins, blood test for heart attacks. ECG looked reasonably normal for a guy who'd had multiple bypasses, so we sent him off to get his ultrasound, then asked him to wait in the waiting room. During this wait, the patient got bored so decided to go for a walk around the block. Results from both tests came back. Ultrasound showed a tumor and troponins were raised, so the patient was urgently admitted to hospital. Heard from the cardiologist this week, confirmed AMI and B-cell lymphoma. Crazy way for lymphoma to present. His white cell counts from less than a month ago were completely normal. Not really surprised he's alive, but surprised he presented as well as he did. He's been on aggressive chemo, so I'll be surprised if he's alive for much longer at this age. Not a doc, but my dad heard those words several times. This is a faking novel, but it's one of those memories I remember distinctly. It's going to get buried anyway. He was driving along I-75 or I-94 in Michigan, I can't remember which are perpetually under construction. So he's in his Avalanche, puttering along between two concrete barriers. He's looking around and sees a transport truck barreling down behind him. He could see the name on the front of the truck and noticed the one in front of him was the same name. Then he hears frantic truck horn honking. The truck in front of him was trying to move as far to the right as possible and was knocking over concrete barriers in the process. The one behind had radioed to the one in front and told him he was going to be rear-ended and there was another vehicle in between. My dad knew he was going to get hit. He considered getting out and running, but 8 feet to his left was the oncoming traffic. He pulls the truck as far to the left as he possibly can, so the driver's side is not behind the truck. He dropped his arms by his sides and pressed his head back into his seat, hoping to avoid the airbag. He doesn't remember anything past that until the EMTs arrived. He looked around and the truck was bent in two. If one stood at the fender in front of the passenger side, they could have kicked their leg out and hit the corner of the back bumper. We've always had tinted windows in our vehicles, so the police/EMTs couldn't see in. Finally he was able to hear again. He didn't hit his head or anything. The doctors said he was probably just overwhelmed, and people outside the truck were saying they couldn't see him. So he starts waving his hands around and notices there is a gap almost 2 feet between the top of the door and the roof. He reaches up, and I guess you could have heard a pin drop. Immediately they start trying to get on top of the truck. In the process, Dad hits the window controls, and the back window comes down. He looks over, and there are people ready to help him out. He manages to climb over the seats, get out of the window, and completely break down. Other stuff happened that isn't as important. I got home from school that day, and asked Mom where Dad was, because he was supposed to bring me somewhere. No response. Hey Mom, did Dad forget he was supposed to bring me? Still nothing. So my 11-year-old self decided I needed to yell at her. She played a message on the answering machine from the Michigan police saying there was an accident, and my dad's phone was crushed, but he is okay. I start flipping out. You can't just say that to a kid. A couple hours later, my grandfather dropped my dad off, and I remember looking at him like, how the hell is he vertical? He had 3 scratches on his cheek, and 1 on his shin. His pants were slightly torn, from getting caught on a faking piece of concrete, completely unrelated to the accident. The 3 little cuts were tiny pieces of the windshield that were embedded in him. Externally, he was fine. Internally, most of his muscles were strained. 3 of his wisdom teeth cracked and had to be removed. He was off work for 13 months and couldn't lift anything heavier than a 6-pack of beer. If any of my family was with him, we'd all be dead. The dashboard was sitting on top of the front passenger seat, and the back of that seat almost reached the rear window. It was nuts. When we went to see the truck at the scrapyard, I still can't believe he wasn't injured even more. I'm not a doctor, but a volunteer firefighter. Had a code 3, German code for emergency with lights and sirens on, where we got the notice that a motorcycle had hit the end of a traffic jam and slammed into the back of the car. We drove on the autobahn, interstate, to get to the accident. About 10 minutes later we were there and saw the back of the car completely smashed and the bike completely wrecked. BMW S1000RR. So we could guess that he had a speed of more than 200 km/h. But we can't see a body or body parts anywhere, not even blood to be seen. Cop who was already there told us that the biker is alive. We all looked at each other and went over to the ambulance, and he is sitting there stripped of his protective clothing, without a single scratch. He didn't have anything. He was completely unharmed. He just had a few bruises on his back, and apparently he managed to jump up from his bike just seconds before the impact, avoiding crashing into the car, and landed in a 18-wheeler with a canvas cover full of styrofoam and cardboard boxes which stopped the impact. Later we read the accident report, and that the bike's speedometer stopped at 295 km/h at the moment of the accident. Still no faking clue how that guy survived. I'm not a doctor, but one of my closest friends was in a horrible car accident and lost her mother and unborn baby sister on the way to the hospital to give birth. My friend's father and brother were 100% okay, minus a fractured arm. My friend, however, was in the hospital and they didn't ever expect her to come out alive. She had a fractured skull, a shattered leg and arm, and her sinus had appeared to be punctured, and she was in a coma. The worst was her sinus, as it is dangerously close to the brain. The surgeons prepared to undergo a long surgery the next morning, without even knowing if she'd make it under anesthesia. The doctor on call the next day could not believe her eyes. They ran my friend for some tests/x-rays one last time, and they found nothing wrong with her sinus. This appeared to be a miracle, because she was terminally ill the previous night. It was true. Her sinus was fine. The only medical complication she has, to this day, is no sense of smell. Was it a mistake on the first test? No one can be sure, not even her doctors. My friend is convinced it was her mom watching over her. Okay, I'm not a doctor, but I'm a menace to myself. First time I should have died was as a baby. I kept having seizures, and would stop breathing, and would spike insanely high fevers. Eventually they found out I had a nigger immune disorder. Eventually my immune system leveled out, but I still get sick extremely easily. If I don't get my flu shot every year, I'll end up in bed with the flu for 2 weeks. The second time I should have died was when I was 18. I was a passenger in a little Ford Taurus and some guy was drunk and driving on the wrong side of the highway in a '89 Dodge Ram. His front bumper came through the windshield where I was sitting. I would have died had my boyfriend at the time not jumped in front of me. He lived as well and tried to kill the guy who hit us, all the while bleeding from his head and being forced against the car by an off-duty paramedic. The third time I should have died was when I took a corner going 30 on my moped wearing flip-flops. I surprisingly limped away with only a severely sprained ankle and road rash on one foot. Oh, I forgot two other instances, both in high school. One asthma attack, where I damn near lost consciousness and laid on the floor of my gym class until things returned to normal. Same year I popped my kneecap out of place while standing on a bench in the locker room and smashed my head against another set of lockers. I was a sight to see after that one. I know it is 2 months later, but I felt my story would do well here. Obligatory, I'm not a doctor, but 4 years ago this month I was in a car wreck. I hit a guardrail head on after having a seizure. My engine basically ended up in my lap. I was trapped for 40 minutes. They had considered amputating both my legs and my left arm. I'm so glad they decided against it. I remember waking up a couple of times with a cop holding my hand and talking to me as they cut me out. They airlifted me to the hospital and I later found out that I was clinically dead twice during this ordeal. I like to joke that I died wrong because I didn't get to go on a trip like most people, because I never had a NDE and didn't see any weird things like a light at the end of a tunnel or spirits. Slightly off topic, I do wonder if people see what they believe in during their NDEs, and since I don't believe in anything, I saw nothing. I ended up in a medically induced coma for about 2 weeks and stayed in the hospital for 8 months. My injuries were, starting from the bottom: a shattered left foot, broken right foot, shattered right ankle, multiple breaks in my left tibia, shattered left knee and broken left femur, broken left hip. They did what they could to repair it, but now I'm missing a piece. Shattered pelvis. Broke my S2, L2, and C3. I had 19 rib fractures. And last but not least, I cracked the front of my skull. I also lacerated my liver, left kidney, and punctured my left lung. I'm now walking and working full time. The recovery process has been hard and is still ongoing. The doctors can't believe I made it out alive and am walking again.